Welcome to the Good Games podcast. I am James.
And I'm Leo.
Yeah. This is the very first episode of the Good Games podcast.
Episode
I
one.
always like when I find a new podcast, I like to listen to the most recent episode and then go back and listen to the very first episode if it's like a long running podcast.
That's a good technique. I like that.
Yeah, to see like how like if the audio quality has improved, just the format differences of the show.
Yeah, oftentimes like the first couple episodes are just total crap, right?
Well, hopefully this is not that. I have been getting ready to move. I've been getting ready to move.
Wow.
It's a lot of work. I don't like doing it. There's just so much stuff to consider. Yeah, you just got to pack up all your stuff. You got to make sure the old apartment's all cleaned out. You got to, make sure all the paperwork's in order, and got to figure out movers. You got to, it's a real bummer.
You got to come up with incentives for all of your friends to come help you. Yeah. Unfortunately, like the older we get, the less patience our friends have for helping out with stuff like that. Like, I've actually had a friend that I've had up here in North Carolina who asked me to help him move, and I was just like, nope. And he was like, why? Like, are you busy this weekend? And I was like, no, I don't do that anymore. That's not something I do. I don't help friends move. Yeah, it's just I've grown past that. Maybe like 20-year-old Leo, but not almost 30-year-old Leo no more.
So I know you are a recent owner of a new Nintendo Switch.
That is true.
How is that going?
So obviously the console is amazing. Just the concept of being able to play it in my living room and then just snap it off or whatever and take it with me. I've done a lot more like handheld gaming with it than anything else, as I've had a lot of travel the past couple months. My thing with the Switch, and I came to you when I bought it, like because I needed recommendations for games. Because to me, they might as well just call it the Nintendo Breath of the Wild. Like,
yeah,
that's really the main reason to get the console. Right. So outside of that game, I think I've started playing some Mario. A little bit.
Nice.
It's good. But to be perfectly honest, like I really was mostly in it for Zelda.
Okay. So that was like the system seller for you. You bought the Nintendo Switch for Zelda.
Yeah. Essentially, from what I've heard, the game was worth, a couple $100. So
now, okay. So you heard that. Now you've finished Breath of the Wild, right?
I have finished the main official, non-DLC story. Yes.
Okay. So what did you think?
Was it worth
the purchase of this entire system?
I gotta say, I think it was.
Okay.
I think it was, which is a lot to say for a single game. But I've only finished the, original content. Haven't even touched the DLCs, and I've already spent at least 70 hours on it. And there's still so much more to find out in the game. Plus, there's the DLCs. So the game alone is I think worth just the console to me.
So you have a long history with the Zelda series, right? We've both played most of them, right?
Yeah.
How does Breath of the Wild stack up against all of the other games in the series?
How I think it stacks up is definitely one of the best.
Okay.
We'll go over our list.
Yeah, well, we're gonna get in. We're gonna have later in the show. We're gonna have a top 5 Zelda games list.
The only gripe I have with it, and it's a common belief, and I think you and I have had a small discussion about this before, that this is a great game for the entry into the Zelda world.
Oh, definitely.
I've never played a Zelda game before, and I'm going to start with Breath of the Wild. I don't necessarily agree with that, but outside of that, the game is just fantastic. I mean, definitely 10 out of 10 for me.
Okay, back up. Why don't you think this is a good entry point to the Zelda series? Because I think it is.
So the problem is, if this is your first Zelda ever, if you've never played another Zelda, it is such a different game. There's
Absolutely.
definitely it still feels like Zelda, but it's so different than all the other Zeldas.
Oh, definitely.
That I think if it opens the gate of Pandora for you and you start playing all the other Zeldas, like you might have a different opinion now of all of the previous Zeldas, because going backwards, like this game is, it's kind of just changing the whole formula,
Hmm.
So there's that. And then the other aspect of it is that if you haven't played any of the previous Zeldas, you're almost like missing out on a lot of like neat things. Like I have a friend, Matt Wong, we both know him.
Okay.
This is his first Zelda. And I was
Okay.
asking him how it
Wow.
was going. Like,
Uh-huh.
and he was like, I'm just like a couple hours in, and I got to that village, like where I'm talking to the old lady or something, and I was like
Kakariko.
Kakariko Village.
Yep.
I'm like, it's Kakariko Village, dude. Like yeah, it's Kakariko Village. Like it's been in so many Zeldas, and he misses out on that because he's never played a Zelda before. You
But
know,
you could say that about literally any other Zelda game, though. Like if I go back and whatever play A Link to the Past, or even the very first Zelda game, I mean, you're gonna have that experience almost regardless, like because all of those games have common elements. It doesn't really matter which one you start with.
I don't disagree there, but I just think Breath of the Wild is so much better having played, other games where I know the old man, I know Kakariko Village, I know and love these reoccurring themes and races and characters.
Mhm.
It just makes Breath of the Wild so much better that I almost feel like you should play another game as a precursor just to like learn the lore as it were, and then enjoy Breath of the Wild even more.
I agree that it does make it better. Like it absolutely, if you have context for all those other games and you go into Breath of the Wild, there's so many things that enhance. It draws on all of those previous games in a way that enhances Breath of the Wild, but you don't have to have played those previous games. There's nothing that requires your knowledge from any previous Zelda game in order to get an understanding of what's happening. They're all like clever winks and nods to the old games, but you're not really missing anything if you're not understanding those references.
That is true. I'll give you that. I guess ultimately the way I feel about it is that it's a fine entry point for anybody. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying like don't make Breath of the Wild your first Zelda game.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like if you were to make another game your first Zelda game, then play Breath of the Wild, you're going to get a little bit more out of it.
Okay, no, I'd agree with that too. I'd agree with that too. But if somebody comes to me and they're like, "Hey, I've never played a Legend of Zelda game. I've heard this series is pretty cool. Where do I start?" I'm gonna say, "There's a really great game called The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Also, it's on a pretty freaking awesome console. And bonus, the console lets you play Breath of the Wild on the go wherever you want. I think that's a pretty
Yeah,
strong
that,
selling point."
that is some strong selling points actually when you put it that way. It's kind of hard to say, hey, you should really check out Ocarina of Time, because okay, yeah, you're gonna have to go buy a Nintendo 64
Yeah,
or run an emulator and it's not going to be as good, or yada. So
yeah. Yeah, I think nostalgia is kind of like play older games are kind of a double-edged sword that way, right? Because you have like so much nostalgia and like good memories tied up with them. And somebody's like, "Oh man, like should I go check out Ocarina of Time?" And you're like, "Oh hell yeah, it's such a great game." And then like reality sets in, and you're like, "Okay, now you either need to track down the original hardware, the N64, which is going to be really hard to find. You're going to have to find it at like a used game store or a garage sale or some sketchy internet site, and then you're going to have to play it with a weird controller.
yep.
Or you can download an emulator online, which is totally illegal, and a ROM for Breath of the Wild. And in my experience, N64 emulation is kind of glitchy. Or you can track down an older Nintendo console like the Wii U or the 3DS and download it on their eShop, which is still not ideal because the ideal way to play that game would be on the Switch, but Nintendo doesn't have a stupid virtual console on the Switch yet, which drives me crazy. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of the problem with recommending older games. That brings me back to how crazy it is that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild exists, right? Because you were talking about the kind of iterative design process that Nintendo has, right? Because they make
Yeah.
they make like a Mario game or a Metroid game or whatever, and it's just kind of incrementally like, hey, it's the same thing you played before, but this time we did something a little bit different, or it's always
Sure.
just
Yeah.
little bit increments. I got the feeling when I was playing Breath of the Wild that they took the Zelda formula, crumpled it up, tore it to pieces, threw it in a trash can, and started all the way over. I don't know if you got that impression as well.
I think so. I guess I don't know because in some ways too, there was some like intricate things to me. Like I don't know how much puzzles were a big part of it, and like how and every other Zelda puzzles were like a major part of the dungeons and stuff. That
Yeah,
like parts of it like it seemed like there was still a core Zelda feel to it, even though the mechanics were all completely different. So yes, I think that they probably just kind of scrapped everything mechanically and said let's just like start from the ground up with the mechanics of this game. But I feel like they still had like this ideology or something that was like the same, you know.
well, here's where I'm coming from with that. Um, so, ever since A Link to the Past, all Zelda game design and the entire progression system of The Legend of Zelda, every game, is all uh, lock and key puzzles that are based around item progression, right? So, like, you think
That's
about
true. Yeah.
you think about Ocarina of Time. You have to have the hook shot before you can get into the Forest Temple. You have to
Right.
have the hammer for the Fire Temple. You have to have the long shot for the Water Temple. Whatever, whatever, whatever. That does not exist in Breath of the Wild. Every
That's
other
a good
Zelda
point.
game that formula applies to. And if you played, did you get a chance to play A Link Between Worlds?
Yes, I did.
They were kind
That'll
of
come up later.
I thought they were kind of experimenting with breaking up that formula a little bit in A Link Between Worlds, because in that game you could rent the items. Like you never got key items from a dungeon. You rented them from, oh god, I can't remember what the character's name is, but you could rent them from him or straight out buy the key items from him. But you could always, as long as you had the money to pay for it, you could get any key item you wanted. Now
Yes,
it,
it
it
kind of broke the pattern a little bit.
it broke the pattern, but the way they enforced that was before you entered the dungeon, there would be a puzzle involving that item. So that way they could guarantee once you got inside the dungeon, they could still
You
guarantee
had
that
it.
you had that key item. And then the dungeon puzzle
Right.
design was still more or less the same as any other Zelda game.
Right.
In Breath of the Wild, yeah, just God, that doesn't exist. Like all all of Breath of the Wild's game systems are kind of built around like emergent gameplay, like right, which is like the collision of different systems, which I think is really cool. And what I mean by that is like, so when you're in a fight and the weather is getting bad and a lightning strikes and it hits the ground and there was like dry grass near the grass catches on fire, and because the grass catches on fire it creates an updraft, and then when you're in a fight you can jump off a cliff and catch the updraft and then like go into an enemy camp from the air and shoot them with a bunch of arrows, and like that that experience to me is what Breath of the Wild is built around. And I think that is so cool because it generates unique stories, like I can have a crazy story like
Yeah.
the one I just described with Breath of the Wild, and you could have an equally crazy story that happened with a completely different set of colliding systems. But like none of that exists in any previous Zelda game, and none of the previous Zelda games like lock and key puzzles in any form exist in Breath of the Wild, for better or for worse. Because I think one of the major nitpicks I would have with Breath of the Wild is the dungeon design. How did you feel about Breath of the Wild's dungeons?
Well, I was about to say that. So like the that was great, and everything you just said, I totally agree with. And it has been sort of a refreshing experience for a Zelda game to not have to go and get the hook shot before you can, continue. You can kind of do anything in whatever order you want and make your own story, and that's great. However, one thing I found kind of lacking was like the core dungeons of the game
Mm-hmm.
that like I mean, they just seem kind of lackluster. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, not very challenging. They kind of lacked the uniqueness of having to use a specific item. That's kind of how they added that uniqueness in the previous Zelda. So I'm not
Oh,
sure
I
how
don't
you would
think so.
fix
Because
that problem.
I agree with you that the dungeons are kind of samey and boring, frankly, but I think you can still create unique dungeons without having without requiring that Link has a certain set of items when you walk in. Like you can just do that aesthetically, right? Because like think of, I'm gonna go back to Ocarina of Time again. Like think of like the visual design of the Fire Temple versus the Shadow Temple versus the Water Temple. Like you can have crazy
Mhm.
aesthetic designs which don't enforce any particular set of items, but like every dungeon in Breath of the Wild visually just kind of looks exactly the same.
And it's not just visual, actually, too. It's also like, the water temple had a lot of verticality to it, where
Yeah,
you had to
yeah.
unlock different
Mm-hmm.
like levels,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the forest temple was more sort of linear,
Mm-hmm.
like kind of square rooms, like stuff like that.
I love Breath of the Wild, and I love the idea. Even though I love all the previous Zelda games, I love the idea of taking the Zelda formula and just throwing it in the trash. I love uh, the kind of crazy experiment that Breath of the Wild is. But uh, the lackluster dungeons make me wonder if Nintendo was not prepared for puzzle design without the traditional Zelda formula.
Well, and I'll say this much, okay? This is their first game
Mm-hmm.
having thrown out the Zelda formula, we presume,
Mm-hmm.
and starting anew.
Mm-hmm.
So for a first run at it, I gotta say it's amazing. Definitely, I think that probably if anyone's going to complain about anything, it's probably going to be that that some of the dungeons were lackluster.
Mm-hmm.
I bet that they can take that information, take what they've learned, and work on some more kind of unique and interesting dungeon design in a future iteration of Zelda.
Oh God, I hope so. I hope so. I would love another game like Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
Before we move on, though, what did you think about the game aesthetically? So that means music. That means the visual presentation.
Uh, Visual presentation, very well done. I was very impressed.
I think that
It
game
kind
looked
of had this.
gorgeous.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it had this like really good blend of kind of like cell shading, like kind of like beautiful, like animated
Yeah, it
look.
was like halfway.
But it also, you could tell,
It was like halfway between Wind Waker and I don't know Twilight Princess or something. It reminded me constantly
yeah,
of like a Miyazaki anime.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And the art design had that look as well,
Mm-hmm.
just like the character faces and stuff
Mm-hmm.
too. I thought that was all great. Um, as far as sound and music, I guess that probably left something, wanting it for me a little bit. Music has been such an integral part of the Zelda
Yep.
series for me.
Yep.
Uh, and you can definitely hear some of the common motifs like throughout the game, but the fact that there wasn't like as much of an emphasis on it, I think, because it kind of would be annoying, probably, to be honest, if uh, the music was like too overpowering for like kind of the repetition of fighting enemies over and over.
Mm-hmm.
I think they almost on purpose made it a little bit more of a subtler
Oh,
note.
absolutely.
And
Because every previous
yeah,
Zelda game, the score is just right up in your face. I mean, go all the way back to
right, right,
original Zelda with the super catchy main theme and A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. All of the music has been like right up in your face, front and center. I really liked the idea of taking the soundtrack and just kind of putting it in the back seat because it to me what that did when you're having less of like music in your face all the time, that allowed the soundscape to really come out, right? So like when Link is like in the forest, you hear the rustling of the trees and the tweeting of the birds and like the wind, uh, you know, all of the nature sound effects. And if this game is supposed to be about Hyrule being sort of reduced back to it's been reclaimed by nature, right? I liked the idea of putting the soundscape of all of the nature in the front and having the music take a back seat. I really like that decision. I know that the reason I asked is because that's sort of a controversial thing. A lot of people have said, like, oh, the music's not as good in this game, which I sort of
right.
disagree with. I don't think the music is any. I mean, it's not as memorable, right? You don't have all of the a million super catchy, memorable tunes of the previous Zelda games, but I like the artistic decision to let the nature soundscape come to the front and the music take a backseat.
I think it was done on purpose, and I think it was a good design choice for the game. I think it's just from a personal. I'm an in your face
Uh-huh.
musically type of guy,
Uh-huh.
so I'm coming from a personal aspect of like wanting that in your face sort of musical experience sometimes, I guess.
What did you think about the narrative, like the story? Because I felt the narrative was also pretty sparse. It was basically just delivered through cutscenes.
I actually felt like it was one of the most interesting narratives, I guess, that I've ever experienced in a Zelda. And I was like actually like really interested in the characters. There was admittedly very few like interactions with them, but like I don't know, I found them to be. I want to know more about these characters. I'm kind of like kind of mysterious and their backstory. Like I just want to know more about them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like a refreshing change of pace actually. With like I was much more into the story and the sort of passion behind the relationships between the characters than most Zeldas, to be honest.
Yeah, I loved the Breath of the Wild characters. I'm gonna come down on the opposite side of the narrative, though. I mean, it's fine. It's a Zelda game. It was whatever. It's the Link and Zelda versus Ganon. It's sort of the whatever standard fare for the.
But it was such a cool twist. It's like it's been 100 years. It's not your typical Zelda narrative.
That's
It's
true,
like
I guess.
everyone's dead.
I was expecting a little bit more for a game that took the mechanical formula and tore that up and threw it away. I was expecting sort of the same thing with the narrative formula. Like, give me something crazy, you know?
I do feel that at the end of the game, it should have been like, oh, actually, Zelda's dead. This is what we're doing now.
Let's-
Like, like to your point, I think the game was so different and so unique for a Zelda game that they should have done something like some sort of like what a twist at the end, like that.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what I was expecting, but I was expecting something wild like that. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, I do think that was lacking. Yeah, because that's one of the major plot holes. I think I talked about it last time I saw you too. Is that like the whole concept of Zelda being like just kind of trapped in time, restraining Ganon from being free, and then somehow coming out of it like unscathed and still not old.
Mhm.
And it's just very confusing. It's kind of like there's
Yeah,
some
I
kind of
didn't
plot
get
holes
that
there
either.
that
I
I don't
didn't
really understand.
understand because all of the other characters seem to have aged or died or whatever. I mean, I guess you can explain
Yeah,
the fact that
right.
Link hasn't really aged because he was in some whatever rejuvenation tank. But why is Zelda still exactly the same age?
Right. She wasn't in a rejuvenation tank, so I don't really get that.
I also kind of thought that, like, I mean, the character of Zelda was kind of interesting in all of the cutscenes that Link was having, but that's kind of the only development that character gets. I was really hoping that she would exist as more of a real character towards the end of the game, but she's just kind of always a disembodied voice. Like her only appearances are in the cutscenes. I kind of felt like that was a little bit
Yeah.
of a waste of Zelda, but then again, Zelda has also always just kind of been a plot device, more or less, because in every other Zelda game, she's either non-existent or you have to go save her from Ganon or whatever. All right, let's move on. All right, so we're going to move into our top five section of the show. We're going to count down from 5 to 1, a different topic every show. This week's topic is our favorite top five Legend of Zelda games. I'm going to go first. Number five, my number five Legend of Zelda game favorite. My number five
Uh,
favorite Legend of
uh,
Zelda game
I'm ready.
is A Link to the Past. I think A Link to the Past is the first time that you really see the Zelda formula get solidified, right? So if you think, think of the rusted buttons in the Fire Temple in A Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. This is what I'm talking about.
Right.
So when you walk into the Fire Temple, you'll see these rusted buttons, and you'll have no idea how they work or how to press them down until you get the key item in that dungeon, which is the Megaton Hammer, and then you can smash all the buttons. Right? That's what I'm talking about when I say the lock and key structure of puzzles. A Link to the Past is kind of the first time you see that formula get solidified, and I think A Link to the Past really started to not only establish the Zelda formula, but really establish like the game's history with like really good musical themes.
That's true.
A lot of the like musical themes that we associate with all of the other Zelda games made their first appearance in A Link to the Past. I also think it is probably the best 2D Zelda.
Interestingly enough, my number 5 is also Link to the
Get
Past.
out of here! What do you think about A Link to the Past?
Link to the Past, I came to it later on. I had played another Zelda previous to it. I'm not sure that that had anything with it being lower on the list. I think a lot of people would put it very high on the list of
Uh huh.
Zeldas.
Yep.
Granted, top 5 is still pretty high,
Yeah. Sure.
but it is on the bottom of my top 5 list. I think it's a fantastic design for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. It kind of defines Zelda to me in a lot of ways, more so than the Zeldas previous to it,
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just, to me, kind of like the basic formula of the traditional Zelda game. It had everything that most Zelda fans love about Zelda games, and that's really why it's in my top 5 list.
Same number 5. I wonder how much overlap we're gonna have here.
I wonder too. I'm kind of curious. This is kind of fun.
I wonder if we're gonna have the exact same 5. Well, we'll find out. My number 4 favorite Zelda game of all time is The Wind Waker. Really like the sense of adventure that this game gives. I like that when you first get Link's ship and you set sail on the high seas and the music comes in, the ba 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 ba, like you're in for a good
That
time,
was fun. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I really love the music in that game. I love the visual direction of that game. So if you go back to God, when was that game? When did that game come out? It was early 2000s, right? When you go back to
Yeah, early 2000s. Yeah.
when that game came out, and when we first saw footage of that game, that was like super contentious. Do you remember that? Like, oh, cartoon Link. Like, oh
Mm-hmm.
no.
It still strikes a chord with me a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie.
Okay, well, I really love the visual design of The Wind Waker. I think that game has aged better than the game that came before it, Ocarina of Time, or the console game that came after it, Twilight Princess. I think it is the most expressive version of Link that has ever existed, because he's got this big cartoon face and all of his features are super huge, right? You can never not know what Link is feeling or thinking. And that goes for
That
like
is true.
all of the NPCs in that game. They're just so like exaggerated and cartoony, and I really like that visual style. And also, like, when I think of the Wind Waker, just the color palette, just like, it's got such a good color palette. You think of like the blue of the ocean and the red of Link's ship and the green of his tunic and the yellow of his hair, like just what vivid colors do they just pop? I don't know. I really love the visual style of the Wind Waker.
And also, just to talk a little bit about Wind Waker, uh, I hated that game. I was not a
Oh
fan at all.
no! What?
Yeah,
Scandalous!
just not. I
Scandalous!
did
What did you
not
hate
like
about
that
the
game.
Wind Waker?
Everything that you just said you loved about it.
Oh, what? Are you what?
Yeah. Although I do admit the sailing was very fun. That was pretty cool.
My heart is broken. All right,
Yeah.
if we got to pick nits about the Wind Waker, there are two things that I have a problem with. The first is the first time you go to Forsaken Fortress sucks. That
Yeah.
part is so slow, and it introduces all these stealth mechanics, right? So I remember as a kid playing that game, like, oh, so
Oh
this is going to be
God.
like a weird like stealth Zelda. So like you do that whole
Oh, the
stealth
worst.
section, and they teach you to get in the barrel, and if you get caught, you get thrown back to the beginning, and you got to climb the whole Forsaken Fortress, and it's just such a drag. And then you do all that, and the stealth mechanics never come back in that game. So that whole section is such a bummer. And then towards the end of the game, like
Uh,
fetching all of the pieces of the Triforce in the various parts of the ocean is kind of tedious, which I know they addressed a little bit in the re-release on the Wii U. Were it not for those two parts, Wind Waker would be in serious contention for top two, top three without those little blemishes. I adore that game.
our number fours differ. Actually, this was kind of a close between number 4 and number 3.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm gonna go with Link Between Worlds for number
Ooh,
4.
I love that game.
So it's interesting that we mentioned it earlier because it did kind of like sort of break the mold a little bit,
Mhm.
but I just thought it was a very interesting, I don't know, design about this whole concept of kind of these two different worlds that you can intermittently like just go between whenever you wanted, and
Mhm.
the interesting puzzles that developed from that. I thought they were very unique. It was, in my opinion, one of the best, if not the best, 2D games. I actually thought it was a little bit better than Link to the Past in terms of the 2D games.
Controversial.
It is. That is a sort of a controversial belief. But again, this is coming from someone who did not start out with Link to the Past early on.
You know,
So,
I didn't either. I came to that game a little late.
yeah, it's. I still say it's a very good game, still in top 5.
Mhm.
But I do think Link Between Worlds was a little bit more enjoyable for me. Having been familiar with the formula that I mentioned already, it was very like interesting to see them sort of experiment, like we talked about earlier, with breaking the mold a little bit. And yet, it still had that sort of classic 2D Zelda feel that we know and love.
My number 3 favorite Zelda game of all time is Majora's Mask.
Oh man,
Yeah, I love the dark and just kind of surreal and psychedelic and weird feel and style of that game. There has not been any other Zelda game. Like Twilight Princess is sort of dark, but it's kind of dark and dreary and depressing. But Majora's Mask is just weird and spooky, and just no other Zelda game is like that. And I loved. We've talked about in this episode a bunch of times the iterative design process that Nintendo has, where they'll make a game and then they'll just incrementally, here's a couple of things that are a little bit different. And there's so many different ways you can incrementally develop something, right? You can experiment with the visual
Right.
style, like the differences in Wind Waker, or you can experiment with the mechanical formula, like they do in A Link Between Worlds or Breath of the Wild. I liked the experimenting with Zelda aesthetics, right? In Majora's Mask,
Mhm.
which is amazing if you consider that most of that game just has recycled assets from Ocarina of Time, right? All of the especially like all of the NPC models are just lifted directly from Ocarina of Time, but just
Right.
the music and the events of the game and some of the characters are just a little bit creepier and weirder, and I love that style. I also I love the mechanical conceit, the thematic conceit of Majora's Mask, that there are 3 days before before the entire world gets destroyed, and you can rewind time through those 3 days, kind of Groundhog Day style. I loved
Yep.
that the mechanical conceit of that game. And no game has really done a satisfying sort of like time rewinding thing as well as Majora's Mask, I feel. Did you get a chance to play the Sexy Brutale last year?
No.
Yeah, that game sort of had the same sort of like rewind time, and maybe you can change things and maybe things will be a little bit different this time. And it was sort of the iterative sort of thing. Like if you don't do anything, the exact same events will play out the exact same way. Your character is the only one that can change the events, and your character is the only one who is aware of the time progressing and time rewinding in the same way as Majora's Mask. And I don't think any other video game I've played has done it as satisfyingly as Majora's Mask has. I also love the idea of the Bomber's Notebook in Majora's Mask. So if you go back and remember Majora's Mask, the Bomber's Notebook had a listing of like 20 NPCs, and each of the NPCs had optional quests that would give you optional rewards for completing all of the NPCs' quests. And each of the NPCs had unique problems. And the reason I like this so much is I like that kind of design where you're adding optional content that is enriching all of the NPCs in your game. When you're going to these NPCs and learning about their problems and learning about how to solve them, it really humanizes the NPCs in a way that none of it makes the NPCs memorable because, okay, when I think of the NPCs in Majora's Mask as opposed to Ocarina of Time, because they are the exact same NPCs, I mean, the models are exactly the same. I think of the Majora's Mask NPCs and I think of like, oh, their names and their faces as opposed to the exact same ones that occurred in Ocarina of Time, because you spend so much time with them in Majora's Mask, figuring out all their problems and helping them out. And I think that's a really great way of killing two birds with one stone, which is adding optional content, optional side quests to your game, and also fleshing out your game world and really humanizing your NPCs. So yeah, love the Bomber's Notebook.
Well, my friend, we are back on the same train because my number 3 is also Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask was like that one YouTube video of the Mary Poppins trailer, like the original Mary Poppins trailer, and they take it and add like horror music and like clip certain parts of the trailer to make it seem like a horror movie instead of the happy-go-lucky Disney movie that it originally was.
Yeah, like
that's basically
the trailer
Majora's
mashups.
Mask, right? You basically take all the same assets from Ocarina of Time, same sort of music and races and stuff, and you just make it creepy as hell. And I love that.
Yep.
Like you said, yeah, the whole concept of kind of Groundhog Day and like seeing the same events transpire and then trying to figure out where you can alter things was just so like interesting, and so you felt like you actually were in control of like literally like saving the world from this weird moon that was. It's also very Japanese in a way. Like, what is this moon with a face on it and stuff? I have an unhealthy fear of horror games for some reason. I just cannot play them by myself. I have to be like in the daylight with some friend of mine. We have to play the horror game together, because if there's any kind of jump scares or weird environmental stuff, like it freaks me out too much. I'm just too enthralled in the game, I think. There were some parts of Majora's Mask, there were some parts of even probably the creepiest thing in Breath of the Wild was every time the sun moon came out or whatever and had all the monsters and stuff, the creepy music that came on, like I couldn't handle that. I could not handle that. I don't know why. As much as I have a hard time playing through stuff like that randomly, I love it. And I think Majora's Mask did a really good job of just adding kind of some other layers to the Zelda that I think everyone knew and loved. One of the kind of repeating trends of my top 5 is tweaking the formula a little bit. And I think they just really hit the nail on the head with Majora's Mask.
My number 2 favorite Zelda game of all time is Ocarina of Time. For the longest time, I never thought I would play a video game that I liked as much as Ocarina of Time, let alone another Zelda game. That game, when I played that, it was this. So Ocarina of Time was my introduction to the Zelda series. I played this I think in middle school, and it blew my mind. I can remember just how huge the world seemed and how big the scope of that game seemed. I remember just spending hours and hours just doing the mini games and not even caring about the rest of the story or any of that. I loved the unique aesthetics of all of the dungeons. I loved everything about that game. That game is very close to perfect in my book. I think some of the things that we discussed earlier can be counted against it. The fact that visually that game hasn't aged very well, and there is currently no modern hardware that you can play that game on, which is a huge, huge bummer, unless you count downloading it on the 3DS or the Wii U. But God, that just speaks to how much the Switch needs a virtual console so that we can download Ocarina of Time and take that anywhere.
It really does. It really does.
Yeah. What is your number 2?
Well, you know what? Let's just go ahead and say what your number 1 is, because then I think it'll make more sense when I say mine.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say, if you haven't guessed it already, my number 1 is Breath of the Wild. I'll come back to that. Back to that, but I want to hear your number 2.
And the reason I say that is because my number 2 is Breath of the Wild. And my number 1 is Ocarina of Time.
All right, let me hear your thoughts on any more additional thoughts on Breath of the Wild.
Okay, so Breath of the Wild, it's the reason it's not in my number 1 spot. I've kind of already gone over. I think that Zelda as a historical franchise offers a lot more to me. If you are I guess, kind of part of that history. I think that the game stands on its own very
Hmm.
well. It's a great entry point for people who want to let it be that entry point. It's a very close separation of number two, number one. I'm not saying Ocarina of Time is this crazy much better, but it's just this feeling of a more complete enjoyment, I guess, that I get from my number one spot than I do my number two
Okay.
spot. Still, that being said, fantastic game. Definitely one of the best. It's up there with the best, in my opinion. Not a lot of bad things you can say about it, really.
All right, so I'm going to hop back to my number one, which is Breath of the Wild. And here's why Breath of the Wild is my number one. So, we discussed a little bit ago some of the things I count against Breath of the Wild, but this is still one of my all time favorite video games because its strengths so far outclass those weaknesses that we talked about. I loved just all of the collisions, the crazy collisions of systems in Breath of the Wild. I love that everything in that game is physics enabled, right? So you take your little bomb,
That's
you take your bomb and you drop it down, and if the wind is blowing too much, that bomb is rolling right down the cliff. Or in the most hilarious circumstance possible, you throw the bomb at the rock wall that you want to bomb, and the wind blows the bomb right back in your face, and you blow yourself up. I love stuff like that. That like even when that happens to you, like you can't be mad. Like it's just so good. I love the visual direction of that game. I like the light use of cell shading on the characters, and I just think that game is gorgeous. Even on the Nintendo Switch, which is a piece of hardware which is not, the most powerful piece of hardware. It's not on par from a performance standpoint with the PS4 or the Xbox, whatever we're on with the Xbox, or even a PC. But even with the lack of hardware power, they managed to make a game that I think looks absolutely stunning.
As I've said, my number one is your number two, Ocarina
Okay.
of Time. And I think what it comes down to between choosing which of these games is your number two and your number one, because it's gonna be one of these
Okay,
two.
yeah.
Like these are definitely
Probably
the
for
top two
most people,
Zeldas,
yeah.
right? For everything that you said, the dungeons in Breath of the Wild were just nothing to write home about. I actually did not like the fact that I kept having to find these weird memories to get more about the story of Zelda and stuff. Uh, Aesthetically, it was amazing. Everything else was amazing. It's still one of the top Zeldas, but Ocarina of Time, it's just like, if I could say it in one phrase, it's in your face. It is like, bam, here's the title and an awesome
Mhm.
song. Here's your story. Here's your bad guy. There's your girl. Here's a fucking ocarina. You got to figure that out for yourself. The music was just like we talked about before, very, in your face. Very, I'm also, a musician and a lover of
Mhm.
music, and how much music interplayed into all of the kind of thematically, the dungeons, the fast forwarding of time, which was kind of their way of breaking the mold a little bit. There is some nostalgia in there as well. I'm not gonna lie, but really just looking back to as a whole, like the game design and also kind of like what it did for the history of games and the development of
Oh,
games, like,
absolutely. That game is so
then
influential.
on. It's just huge. It's just absolutely monumental. I cannot put any other Zelda above it for all those reasons. And as far as it being kind of more difficult to play these days, or definitely visually, it did not age well, but neither did any Nintendo 64 game, in my
That's true.
opinion. Those are things, I guess. I kind of look at things in a vacuum, and for the sake of this, top five list. So obviously, aesthetically, it's not that appealing anymore, and technologically speaking, there's Breath of the Wild is just light years ahead of it. But it's just kind of the importance of the game and the in your faceness of it that I just love it, man. It's just, to me, it's just the greatest Zelda that will ever be made,
Mm.
and that's how I feel about it.
That's good. That's good. I like that my fear was that we were going to have the exact same top five lists. I'm glad we had a little bit of variation in there, and I love that you had a spot for A Link Between Worlds because I thought that game was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, that game made a surprising impact
Mhm.
on me for a little 3DS game. Yeah.
Before we wind the show down, I thought, Leo, that we could do a good public service for all of our listeners out there by recommending some products or some media, maybe some movies, maybe some games, for our listeners that we've been enjoying and we want to get the word out about. So, what recommendations do you have? What endorsements do you have?
All right. I've been playing a lot of League of
Mm-hmm.
Legends. If you have not checked it out, definitely. I think it's worth a check out. Just be wary that you might get addicted and lose your loved ones.
Okay, because I am that audience. I have not checked out League of Legends, so pitch it to me as though you're sell me on this.
Okay, so if you like strategy,
I do.
if you like character development in the sense of RPG
Like
stats,
character
not
progression,
like story
Mm-hmm.
progression, character progression, right? But you want to experience that within the confines of a 30-minute
Mm-hmm.
game instead of 30 hours. And if you like competitive, multiplayer experience, the game is worth a shot. Basically, in 30 minutes, you go from level 1 to max level. You can feel like the hero of your own little mini game, but it is multiplayer action. There is multiplayer strategy. There is bragging. There is, trash talking, and it has this whole community of esports, and ESPN too has played stuff. There is a huge kind of skill aspect of it. So if you like fighting games and other like kind of like multiplayer, like esports type
I have
of
been
games,
getting into fighting games.
you got to try it. You got to try it out at least once just to see what all the fuss is about, because it is probably, if not the most popular competitive game. That's got to be one of the top.
So my endorsement this episode is going to be a really bad movie. So I know you and I have both seen this movie. It is a really
Oh man, I know what's coming up.
It is a really, really, really bad movie. And I happen to enjoy watching a really good, terrible movie. And my favorite terrible movie of all time is Tommy Wiseau's The Room. If you do not know what this is, you can probably get you can probably order his DVD straight from his website, which I think is TommyWiseau.com. It has been described by other people as the Citizen Kane of bad movies, which I do not dispute that title. It is so perfectly bad. This man, Tommy Wiseau, produces, directs, and stars in his own movie, and he wrote the movie as well. Yeah. And it's not good. So I've seen a lot of bad movies. I really enjoy watching bad movies. The first time I watched this movie, I was about 10 minutes in, and I was like, wow, this is a particularly bad movie. This is pretty terrible. The acting was bad. The script was bad. This had all the hallmarks of a really good bad movie. I got about 20, I don't know, maybe 30 minutes into that movie. I was on the floor laughing. I couldn't breathe. This movie...
I was there. I'll test
Yes, I could not breathe. I was laughing so hard. I totally endorse ordering. If you have not seen Tommy Wiseau's The Room, that is just the title is just The Room. Get a group of your closest friends together. Order a DVD, order a Blu-ray of this terrible, terrible movie. And if you have people who love to laugh at good, bad movies, this is definitely one of, if not the best all-time good, bad movie.
Mm-hmm. Order a few drinks too, because you might
need them. There are, yes, if you like drinking games, you can Google rules for The Room drinking game. Be careful though, there are a couple rules that might get you totally hammered.
I feel like I want to go ahead and back your endorsement as well, because it's not that it was a bad movie. I think it is the worst movie of all time. And it's not just because like cinematically, like, or how it's written. It's just everything around how it was made, and just the fact that he spent probably millions of dollars but won't ever tell anyone where he got the money from. Yep. Like, just everything about that movie, from production to big reveal, and the fact that it failed as a movie and now has succeeded as hilariously one of the funniest movies. It's kind of a cult following now. Just everything is fail and terrible, and it's beyond just a bad movie. It is just the worst cinematic experience you could possibly have.
It is definitely a good time, though. I definitely endorse that.
Yeah. Oh, it's just so good, so bad it's good.
Yes.
It's unbelievable, unbelievably good.
All right. Well, Leo, do you have anything else?
Man, I think that's it for me. I don't really. I'm looking forward to many more
Yeah.
episodes, and yeah, this has been
All
fun.
right. Well, for the Good Games podcast, I am James.
And I'm
All
Leo.
right. And we will see you next episode. On the next show, we will have a discussion of the cult MMO Star Wars Galaxies, as well as our top 5 favorite Star Wars games. So look forward to our next episode.
I cannot wait.
We will see you next time.
See ya. I was going to say it sounds like all of the women in our lives.
Maybe. Oh God, were you just looking for an excuse to use that soundbite there?
I was sorry. You can edit that part
out. Maybe I'll put it at the end of this podcast as a bumper or something.
Okay.